Yokosuka Naval Base. September 2nd, 1945. The day after formal Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri. The harbor stretched before the Allied inspection teams, crowded with gray steel hulls riding at anchor. Warships that days earlier had been the property of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now they were simply assets, prizes of war, hardware to be divided among the victors like any other conquered territory. Commander Robert Mitchell stood on the pier, clipboard in hand, studying the vessels. He'd been assigned to the Naval Technical Assessment Team, tasked with documenting every Japanese warship that survived the war. His specialty was cruisers, heavy cruisers specifically, the big 8-inch gun ships that had formed the backbone of Japanese surface combat power throughout the Pacific War. Ships that American sailors had fought, feared, and ultimately defeated. Now, those same ships sat silent, guns cold, crews removed, awaiting decisions made in distant capitals about their final disposition. Some would sail again under different flags. Some would be studied, dissected, their technological secrets extracted. Some would be destroyed in weapons tests. And some would simply be scrapped, reduced to raw steel to feed the reconstruction of a shattered post-war world. The question of what to do with captured Japanese warships had been debated among Allied powers since 1944, when victory became increasingly certain. The Soviet Union wanted ships. Britain wanted ships. China wanted ships. The United States, already possessing the world's largest navy by substantial margin, was less interested in the ships themselves than in ensuring no future Japanese naval threat could emerge. But the Soviets were insistent. The Soviet Navy had been largely absent from the Pacific War, contributing minimally to Japan's defeat. Yet Stalin demanded compensation. Soviet negotiators argued that the USSR had suffered enormously in Europe, had borne the brunt of German military power, had earned the right to spoils in both theaters. And spoils meant warships. Modern warships that could enhance Soviet naval capabilities in the Pacific. The Americans were ambivalent. Giving the Soviets advanced warships seemed potentially problematic, especially as relations between former allies were already cooling into what would become the Cold War. But denying Soviet demands risked diplomatic confrontation at a moment when cooperation was still necessary for occupying and administering conquered territories. The compromise was to divide Japanese naval assets among the major Allied powers, with allocation based partly on contribution to victory and partly on diplomatic necessity. Japan's heavy cruiser fleet in September 1945 was a shadow of what it had been in 1941. Of the 18 heavy cruisers Japan possessed at the war's beginning, only 5 survived to surrender. 13 had been sunk in combat, lost to aircraft, submarines, surface action, or the simple grinding attrition of a war fought across thousands of miles of ocean. The survivors were Myoko, Takao, Aoba, Tone, and Haguro. Each represented different stages of Japanese cruiser development. Each had different combat histories, and each would meet different fates after the war. Myoko was the oldest survivor, completed in 1929 as the lead ship of her class. She displaced over 13,000 tons, carried 10 8-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, and had been designed to outgun and outrun potential American cruiser opponents. In the early war years, she'd been formidable, fast, heavily armed, effective at night combat where Japanese optical equipment and training gave them advantages. But by 1944, she was obsolescent. American cruisers had radar fire control. American naval doctrine had evolved to neutralize Japanese night fighting advantages. And Myoko herself had been damaged repeatedly. In December 1944, Myoko struck a mine in the South China Sea. The explosion tore a massive hole in her hull, flooding compartments, killing crew members, destroying machinery. She limped to Singapore for repairs, but resources weren't available. Shipyard capacity was overwhelmed with more critical vessels. Materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been killed in air raids or diverted to other projects. Myoko sat in Singapore for months, partially repaired, but never fully operational. When Japan surrendered, Myoko was still in Singapore. British forces occupied the port immediately after the surrender announcement. They found the cruiser moored at a commercial pier, listing slightly from incompletely repaired flood damage. Her guns still functional, but her propulsion system crippled. British naval officers inspected the vessel thoroughly, documenting damage, assessing whether repair was feasible. The conclusion was negative. Myoko was too damaged to be worth repairing. The mine damage was extensive. Critical machinery components would need complete replacement. The cost and effort would exceed the value of the ship, especially since the Royal Navy already had modern cruisers and didn't need a damaged Japanese vessel of obsolescent design. The decision was made quickly. Myoko will be scrapped. But scrapping wasn't immediate. Post-war Singapore was chaotic. The Japanese occupation had devastated the local economy. Infrastructure was damaged. Supplies were scarce. And tens of thousands of Japanese military personnel needed to be repatriated. Priorities focused on humanitarian concerns and basic administration. Disposing of a damaged cruiser was low priority. Myoko remained moored in Singapore for over a year, stripped of usable equipment by British salvage teams. Guns removed and either scrapped or retained for technical analysis. Fire control systems examined and documented. The hull itself sat abandoned, rusting in tropical humidity, home to rats and birds. Workers
slowly
cut Myoko
apart,
apart, reducing
Finally,
the once
in July
powerful cruiser to
1946,
steel plates.
a Dutch
and
salvage
scrap
company
components. Was contracted
By early
to break up the
1947,
ship. The Netherlands
nothing remained
rebuilding its
except
colonial
documentation
presence
in
in
the
British
East
Admiralty
Indies
files
needed
and
scrap
photographs
metal.
taken during
Singapore
the
needed the
inspection
berth
process.
space.
Takao
The
had a
economic
different
calculation
history
was
and
straightforward.
different fate.
Over several
She was
months,
newer than Myoko, completed in 1932, incorporating design improvements based on operational experience with earlier cruisers. She carried the same armament, 10 8-inch guns, but had better armor protection, more advanced fire control, improved seaworthiness. In the early war years, Takao had been extremely active. She participated in the invasions of the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous surface actions against Allied forces. But like Myoko, Takao suffered cumulative damage that reduced her effectiveness. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she was torpedoed by the American submarine USS Darter. 2 torpedoes struck her bow, causing massive flooding, destroying her forward compartments, killing dozens of crew members. The damage was so severe that Takao couldn't continue with the battle formation. She turned back, escorted by destroyers, limping towards Singapore at reduced speed. The journey to Singapore took days. Takao's bow was barely above water. Pumps ran continuously to control flooding. Her speed was limited to 8 knots. American submarines hunted for her, knowing a crippled cruiser was a valuable target. But she made it, arriving at Singapore in late October 1944. And there she remained for the rest of the war. Repair work began, but proceeded slowly. Resources were limited. Higher priority vessels took precedence. Air raids disrupted work schedules. By mid-1945, it was clear Takao would never return to combat readiness before the war ended. She sat in Singapore Harbor, a floating hull with damaged bow sections, functional guns, but limited mobility. When surrender came, she was still there. The British, again occupying Singapore, inspected Takao more favorably than Myoko. While damaged, the damage was localized to the bow. The machinery was functional. The armament was intact. With sufficient investment, Takao could potentially be repaired and returned to service. But would the investment be worthwhile? The answer depended on who was asking. For the British, already operating numerous cruisers and facing post-war budget constraints, the answer was no. But for other nations, particularly those with smaller or less modern navies, a damaged but reparable heavy cruiser might be valuable. The question became, who would get Takao? Under the Allied Agreement for Distributing Japanese Naval Assets, certain ships were allocated to specific nations based on negotiated quotas. Takao was allocated to Great Britain, giving the British the right to decide her fate. They could repair her and add her to the Royal Navy. They could transfer her to another nation. They could scrap her, or they could use her for another purpose entirely. The British chose the final option. Takao would become a target ship, used to test weapons' effectiveness against modern warship construction. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty or waste. Understanding how modern weapons performed against actual warship structures was critical for developing effective post-war naval designs. You could calculate theoretical penetration values for bombs and shells, but actual testing against real ship structures provided data that calculations couldn't match. Operation Sunfish was planned for October 1946. Takao would be towed to the Strait of Malacca, anchored in deep water, and subjected to a series of attacks using various weapons. Bombs dropped from aircraft, shells fired from destroyers, torpedoes launched from submarines. The objective was to assess damage patterns, understand structural failures, determine what worked and what didn't against Japanese construction methods. But there was a problem. Takao was too damaged to survive the tow to the testing area. Her bow damage, never fully repaired, made her unseaworthy for extended movement. Attempting to tow her through open water risked her sinking before the tests could be conducted. Alternative plans were considered. Could the tests be conducted in Singapore Harbor? No, too shallow, too close to shipping channels. Could the bow be repaired sufficiently for towing? Possible, but expensive and time-consuming. The solution was pragmatic. Takao would be used for testing weapons effects on moored ships in protected waters. Not the open ocean scenario originally planned, but still valuable. In July 1946, British engineers placed explosive charges on and around Takao, simulating various combat damage scenarios. The tests measured how Japanese cruiser construction responded to explosions, how bulkheads failed, how armor deformed, how flooding spread through compartments. The data was useful but limited. Takao's pre-existing damage complicated analysis. Distinguishing between damage from the 1944 torpedo hits and damage from the 1946 tests wasn't always straightforward. Still, engineers gathered information about steel quality, welding techniques, compartmentation design, and structural resilience that informed future warship construction. After the tests concluded, Takao remained afloat but heavily damaged. The question became disposal. Salvaging her was deemed uneconomical. She was towed to shallow water near Singapore and deliberately sunk. The wreck sat there for years, gradually breaking up from wave action and corrosion. In the 1950s, commercial salvagers bought the rights to the wreck and removed portions for scrap. But much of the structure remained too deep or too difficult to recover. Aoba had perhaps the most parts of Takao's fate likely remain surviving Japanese cruiser. A fragmentary monument to a ship that survived the war only to be destroyed by her representing the earliest generation of Japanese. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, throughout the war. Hit the subscribe button. She'd been at the battle, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are August 1942. One of the most devastating Japanese naval victories, where a force of cruisers surprised and destroyed multiple Allied cruisers in a night surface action. Aoba had contributed to that victory, her guns hammering American ships in the darkness. But she'd also been damaged repeatedly. Torpedoes, bombs, shells, Aoba accumulated scars throughout the war. By 1945, she was worn out, machinery degraded from years of hard use and insufficient maintenance. Armor pierced and patched multiple times. Her combat value was minimal, but she remained afloat, and that made her an asset to be distributed. Aoba ended the war at Kure Naval Base near Hiroshima. She'd been damaged in a July 1945 air raid, taking bomb hits that killed crew members and caused severe fires. The damage wasn't immediately fatal, but repair was impossible. Resources didn't exist. She was moved to a shallow berth where, even if she sank from progressive flooding, she wouldn't block deeper channels needed for other vessels. When American forces occupied Kure in September 1945, they found Aoba listing heavily, partially flooded, clearly beyond economic repair. Her allocation under the distribution agreement went to China, specifically to the nationalist Chinese government. China, having suffered enormously during the war, having lost virtually its entire modern navy to Japanese action, desperately wanted warships to rebuild naval capability. But Aoba was worthless as a functional warship. She couldn't be repaired. She could barely float. The Chinese initially hoped to tow her to China and use her as a training hulk, a stationary platform where sailors could learn shipboard systems without the ship actually needing to move. But even that proved impractical. Towing Aoba in her damaged condition risked losing her at sea. The cost of tow vessels, the time required, the risk involved, it all exceeded the value of a non-functional hulk. The Chinese abandoned the idea. Aoba remained at Kure, now an orphaned asset nobody wanted. The Americans, administering the occupation, needed to clear Kure's harbor of damaged vessels to restore the port to commercial use. Aoba was blocking a valuable berth. The solution was simple and final. In November 1946, demolition charges were placed throughout Aoba's hull. The explosions broke the ship's back, flooding all compartments, sending her to the harbor bottom. She rested there briefly before salvage operations began. Post-war, Japan desperately needed steel. Scrap metal was valuable currency in the Reconstruction economy. Salvage companies bought the rights to wreck removal from occupation authorities. Over the course of 1947 and 1948, Aoba was systematically cut apart underwater, raised in sections, and scrapped. The process was labor-intensive, dangerous work. Divers cutting steel underwater, workers operating cranes and cutting torches, all extracting usable metal from a war grave containing the remains of crew members who died in the July 1945 air raid. By 1949, Aoba was gone, converted to steel ingots, recycled into the reconstruction of the nation she'd served. There's a certain poetry in that. The warship that helped initiate Japan's Pacific conquests, reduced to raw material for rebuilding a peaceful Japan. But for those who'd served aboard her, who'd fought in her, who'd lost shipmates when she was hit, the undignified end was probably bitter. No ceremony, no recognition, just demolition and scrapping. Tone represented the newest and most advanced heavy cruiser Japan possessed at war's end. Completed in 1938, she incorporated the latest Japanese design thinking. Unlike earlier cruisers with a balanced arrangement of main guns fore and aft, Tone concentrated all 8 8-inch guns forward in 4 twin turrets. The rear half of the ship was devoted to aircraft facilities, catapults, hangars, fuel storage, workshops, everything needed to operate a substantial seaplane complement. This unconventional design reflected Japanese naval doctrine emphasizing reconnaissance. Cruisers were expected to operate far ahead of the main battle fleet, scouting for enemy forces, providing targeting information. The seaplanes were critical to this mission. Tone could launch and recover multiple aircraft, extending reconnaissance range far beyond what ships relying on optical observation could achieve. Tone had fought throughout the war. She'd been at Pearl Harbor, providing reconnaissance aircraft that scouted American defenses. She participated in the Indian Ocean Raid, the Midway Operation, the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. She'd survived all of them, accumulating damage but always remaining operational. By war's end, she was worn but intact, moored at Kure. The Americans inspected Tone with considerable interest. Her unusual design made her valuable for technical study. How effective was the all-forward main armament? What were the trade-offs in concentrating guns versus distributing them? How did the aircraft facilities perform in combat? These questions had theoretical answers, but examining an actual ship that had operated under combat conditions provided practical insights. Under the distribution agreement, Tone was allocated to the United States. American naval architects wanted to examine her thoroughly before deciding her fate. She was towed to a more accessible berth, stripped of removable equipment, and subjected to detailed technical inspection. Teams of engineers measured everything: hull construction, armor layout, machinery installation, fire control systems, aircraft handling equipment. Photographs were taken. Drawings were made. Components were removed for laboratory analysis. The examination took months. What emerged was a detailed understanding of Japanese heavy cruiser design philosophy and its divergence from American approaches. Japanese ships generally traded protection for speed. Once the technical examination was complete, they used welding more extensively than American ships. She had no value as an operational unit. They had excellent optical fire control, didn't need Japanese radar technology. American shipyards were producing modern cruisers of superior designs didn't. Tone all was of this simply a curiosity and a technical artifact into American valuable for study, cruiser but not for service. The decision was made to scrap her. But first, one more use. In 1947, Tone was designated as a target for aerial bombing tests. Not the comprehensive Operation Crossroads atomic tests at Bikini Atoll. Those used other Japanese ships, but conventional bombing tests examining how modern aircraft weapons performed against armored warships. In April 1947, Navy aircraft subjected Tone to multiple bombing runs. Bombs of various sizes and types were dropped. Damage was assessed after each attack. Engineers studied how the structure responded, how armor failed, how flooding progressed. The tests confirmed what naval planners increasingly understood. Aircraft carrying modern bombs could devastate even heavily armored warships. The age of the battleship, and to some extent the heavy cruiser, was ending. Aircraft carriers represented the future. Ships like Tone, however well designed for surface combat, were increasingly obsolescent in an era of air dominance. After the bombing tests, Tone was a shattered wreck. Hull below the waterline, superstructure collapsed, barely afloat. She was towed to shallow water and beached. Over the following months, she was cut apart for scrap. By late 1948, Tone had ceased to exist except as documentation in U.S. Navy technical archives and scrap steel sold to commercial buyers. Haguro had the strangest fate of all surviving Japanese heavy cruisers, though she barely survived. She was sunk in May 1945 by British destroyers in the Malacca Strait during the final months of the war. But she sank in relatively shallow water, settled upright on the bottom, and remained substantially intact. When British forces surveyed the area after the surrender, Haguro's wreck was identified as potentially salvageable. The British briefly considered raising her. The wreck wasn't blocking shipping channels, so there was no immediate urgency, and the cost of salvage would be substantial. Diving teams would need to seal the hull, pump out flooded compartments, attach lifting equipment, and carefully raise a 10,000-ton vessel from the seabed. The technical challenges were significant. The economic calculation was questionable. Ultimately, the British decided against salvage. Post-war budget constraints were severe. Britain was essentially bankrupt, having spent everything on the war effort. Salvaging a Japanese cruiser, however interesting technically, couldn't be justified economically. The decision was made to leave Haguro where she lay, and there she remained. For years, the wreck sat on the bottom of the Malacca Strait, slowly deteriorating. Currents scoured away lighter components. Marine growth covered the steel. The structure gradually collapsed as corrosion weakened critical supports. By the 1950s, Haguro was no longer a recognizable ship, but a scatter of wreckage spread across the seabed. In subsequent decades, salvagers occasionally visited the wreck, not to raise it, that was long past feasible, but to recover specific components. Brass fittings, bronze propellers, anything with scrap value that could be cut free and lifted. The work was sporadic, driven by metal prices and the availability of diving equipment capable of reaching the wreck depth. Today, what remains of Haguro is fragmentary and dispersed. Portions of the hull structure persist, heavily corroded, buried in sediment. But much of the ship has been either salvaged or has corroded away entirely. She exists primarily as a historical footnote, a shipwreck occasionally visited by technical divers, marked on navigation charts as a hazard to avoid, but largely forgotten. The distribution of Japan's surviving heavy cruisers among Allied powers revealed interesting diplomatic dynamics. The Soviet Union, despite insistent demands for Japanese naval assets, received no heavy cruisers. All 5 survivors were either too damaged to transfer or were allocated to other powers before Soviet pressure could secure them. The Soviets did receive some smaller Japanese warships and a share of naval infrastructure and equipment, but they were largely excluded from the cruiser distribution. This exclusion wasn't accidental. American and British negotiators were increasingly wary of Soviet intentions. Giving the Soviets advanced warships, even damaged Japanese ones, seemed strategically unwise as Cold War tensions developed. The distribution agreement was structured to ensure Soviet allocations consisted primarily of older, less capable vessels. The valuable prizes went to Western powers or were destroyed in testing. China's allocation of Aoba represented more symbolic than practical value. The nationalist Chinese government wanted to demonstrate it was being treated as a major power entitled to shares of Japanese assets. But the reality was that China lacked the infrastructure, resources, and expertise to operate or repair modern warships effectively. Aoba, unusable and eventually scrapped, illustrated the gap between political aspirations and practical capabilities. Britain's allocations, including Myoko and Takao, reflected its continued interest in maintaining naval presence in Asian waters despite post-war economic constraints. But the decision to scrap or test, rather than repair these ships, revealed British pragmatism. The Royal Navy couldn't afford to operate obsolescent Japanese cruisers when it was already struggling to maintain its own fleet. Better to extract technical knowledge and scrap value than to invest in vessels of questionable worth. American allocations, including tone, demonstrated a different priority. The U.S. Navy was interested in understanding Japanese naval technology, not in acquiring additional ships. America's industrial capacity meant it could build whatever ships it needed. Captured Japanese vessels were valuable as intelligence sources and test subjects, not as operational units. This approach, study, test, dispose, characterized American handling of most Japanese naval prizes.
Varied significantly, with later war production showing degraded properties due to material shortages. They learned about Japanese welding techniques, which were advanced in some respects, but inconsistently applied. They learned about Japanese damage control systems, which were generally inferior to American equivalents, helping explain why Japanese ships were more vulnerable to progressive flooding. This intelligence informed post-war American cruiser design. While the U.S. Navy didn't copy Japanese approaches, American design philosophy was fundamentally different. Understanding Japanese solutions to common naval engineering problems provided useful comparative data. Some Japanese innovations, particularly in optical fire control and torpedo systems, were noted as areas where American designs might benefit from similar approaches. The human dimension of these ships' fates is worth considering. Each cruiser had crew members who'd served aboard her, fought in her, lost shipmates when she was hit. For these veterans, the post-war disposal of their ships, scrapping, target testing, abandonment, was emotionally complex. Pride in their service mixed with bitterness at their nation's defeat, complicated by the knowledge that their ships, which they'd maintained and fought in, were being unceremoniously destroyed by the victors. Some Japanese naval veterans attended scrapping operations, witnessing the dismantling of ships they'd served on. The experience was described as painful. Watching cutting torches reduce a warship to scrap, seeing the hull plates that had protected you in combat being torn apart for raw metal, created a sense of profound loss. These weren't just ships. They were homes, communities, the physical embodiments of years of service and sacrifice. For Allied personnel involved in the inspections, tests, and disposal, the emotional content was different. These were enemy ships recently engaged in combat against Allied forces. They'd killed Allied sailors. They represented a defeated enemy in a war successfully won. Yet even for Allied personnel, there was often professional respect for the engineering and design, an acknowledgement that these were sophisticated vessels built by skilled workers, even if serving a cause the Allies had fought against. The diplomatic process of distributing Japanese naval assets extended beyond just the major warships. Smaller vessels, submarines, auxiliaries, even naval infrastructure like dry docks and repair facilities, all were cataloged and allocated. The process took years to complete, with negotiations continuing into 1947 over specific items. Some allocations were never actually claimed, as nations decided the ships or equipment weren't worth the cost of transfer and operation. The Soviet Union, frustrated by its limited share of Japanese naval assets, took compensation in other forms. They dismantled and removed entire shipyard facilities from Japanese territory under their occupation, shipping the machinery to Soviet ports. They claimed a share of Japanese merchant shipping, receiving several dozen cargo vessels to supplement Soviet merchant capacity. They demanded and received industrial equipment, railroad rolling stock, and other portable assets. This pattern of Soviet compensation through industrial equipment rather than warships became a source of tension between Allied powers. The Americans and British argued the Soviets were exceeding agreed compensation levels. The Soviets argued they were entitled to more given their contribution to victory in Europe. The dispute was never fully resolved, contributing to the broader deterioration of Allied cooperation into Cold War confrontation. The fate of Japan's heavy cruiser fleet represented a microcosm of post-war Allied politics. Cooperation gave way to competition. Shared victory in war didn't translate to shared vision for peace. The distribution of Japanese naval assets became a negotiation reflecting post-war power dynamics, with each nation seeking advantages for future conflicts, even as they were still processing the consequences of the war just ended. For Japan itself, watching its naval assets distributed among the victors was humiliating but also pragmatic. The alternative, allowing Japan to retain a navy, was unacceptable to the Allies. Japanese naval power had threatened every nation in the Pacific. It had initiated the war with the Pearl Harbor attack. It had conquered vast territories. It had killed hundreds of thousands. No Allied power was willing to risk Japanese naval resurgence. The Japanese Constitution imposed by occupation authorities included Article 9, renouncing war and prohibiting maintenance of military forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy was formally dissolved. Its personnel were demobilized. Its ships were surrendered. Its bases were occupied. The institution that had dominated Japanese military culture for decades simply ceased to exist. Former naval officers, engineers, and sailors entered civilian life with skills that often translated poorly to peacetime economy. Some found work in maritime industries, applying their technical knowledge to merchant shipping or shipbuilding. Others struggled, their military expertise irrelevant in occupied Japan. The dissolution of the Navy as an institution and as a career path created a generation of men whose training and experience suddenly had no outlet. The heavy cruisers themselves, scattered across Asian waters, being scrapped or tested or abandoned, represented the death of Imperial Japanese naval ambition. These ships had been symbols of Japan's rise as a naval power. They'd represented technological achievement, industrial capacity, national pride. Their destruction or disposal marked the absolute finality of Japanese defeat. Some of the steel from scrapped Japanese cruisers was recycled into reconstruction of Japan itself. Steel plates that had once formed the hulls of warships were melted down and reformed into girders for buildings, rails for infrastructure, components for machinery. The transformation from instruments of war to tools of rebuilding was both practical necessity and symbolic redemption. The materials that had served destruction now serve construction.